Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. There I am. Alright, we're continuing with History of Horror. And we're pretty much, not really, but sort of kind of finishing up with our buddy Stephen King, with Danse Macabre. He basically wanted to go from 1950 to 1980. Was the 3 decades he was going for. And he does. He talks about, I'm going to use him some more, because he talks about the 40s a bit, because the 40s were kind of a dry period. And he talks about the 30s, of course, with the classic cinema monsters, Bela Lugosi, it's Dracula, and Boris Karloff's Frankenstein in the 30s. And he's going to certainly talk about those, but as far as his general talking about horror, he stops at the 50s for what he's going into the basics. And my notes are all disorganized. Good job being prepared, Drew. So I do have Steven here. Steve, alright. Films and books. I still have my notes on his books and on his films that he talks about. I actually started today. I wanted to start a new book because I was my eyes were blurring every time I tried to read Stephen King for the last couple of days, just because I've read over it three or four times, and I'm trying to keep up on this. So it's research. It's not fun reading anymore. It's the research for the videos. I have my very hot water. It's still very hot. So I started the Leslie Whitten book, Progeny of the Adder. I read Moon and the Wolf earlier, and it's actually in a two books per book, like a collection. Moon of the Wolf and Progeny of the Adder together. They offered that in the 90s for $5, and I bought it used for $2.50. So I'll take it. I like the way Leslie Whitten writes. I picked up another one of his books at a used bookstore, and that might be my next one. It's pretty good. I'm enjoying it. I just started it, but I'm enjoying it. I enjoyed Moon of the Wolf a lot too. As I said several times, the movie was bad, but you can't blame the author for that one. Where am I starting today? I think I'll start back with TV. Okay, so we were in the 50s. History of horror. We'll start with Josh Howard. In the 30s through 50s, Josh Howard makes a point. There's his address at the bottom. Around 1330, he makes a point. RKO's and Universal's monsters ended in the 50s. Hammer Films really got going in the 50s as far as classic monsters go, and is their sci-fi techno-horror, what King calls techno-horror. Because King's going to be talking about Quatermass Experiment, which in the U.S. was released as The Creeping Unknown, so he refers to it as a Creeping Unknown. IMDb refers to it as the Quatermass Experiment. And it's the techno-horror that he really digs, the Quatermass movies, which I should really look at because they sound interesting as heck. Is that on there? Yeah, it's on there. The Quatermass movies. So apparently Quatermass, from the research I did today, Quatermass started on BBC in either TV or maybe even radio. I'm not sure. Way back in the 40s. This is the decade before we're talking about now. Made the transition to made-for-TV movies on Thames Television Production Company, and then Hammer Films picked him up and did a lot of Hammer films, like 5 or 6 as far as I could tell. I didn't do a head count, but quite a few, and still going on and then remade today and stuff. I'm not sure if there's still Hammer movies. I don't know what the rights and copyright things going on with that. But Hammer, of course, is going to be doing what they're most famous for. Christopher Lee's Dracula. The first Dracula movie with Christopher Lee was Horror of Dracula, and that was in '58, so it was in this era. The other guy. The other. The other. Peter Cushing, that's the one I was after. I had to look it up real quick because it was in my brain all day, and of course I didn't write it down, so of course I forgot it. Peter Cushing was in most of these as well. He was Hound of the Baskervilles. He was in that, which we talked about in The Fantastic. That was The Fantastic Uncanny example that Noel Carroll gives. Curse of Frankenstein, The Mummy. These are all the 50s. Mummy was 59. Curse of Frankenstein was 57. Hound of Baskervilles was 59. Horror of Dracula was 58. Those are all Peter Cushing movies. And then, of course, the Quatermass movies, which are King's talking about in techno horror. He talks about techno horror. And finally, 50s and 60s, the division between Armageddon and demonic horror. Again, Josh Howard, I'm not sure what you have to back that one up. I have a list of movies, but they don't really strike me as demonic, or simply Armageddon. I'm not sure if you mean Armageddon meaning all the big bug movies or all the flying saucer, invasion of flying saucer movies. I guess that's Armageddon-ish. It's kind of a stretch. I don't know. But of course the 50s full of saucermen and full of big bugs. Gojira, Godzilla, 54. That's the only one I wrote down of those. That's the truest one. But, Attack of the Giant Leeches, the Giant Gila Monster, Attack of the Shrews, everything getting bigger, and all that stuff. They're the 50s. They're the quintessential, even stereotypical 50s movie would be Attack of Giant something, attacking kids in hot rods. Is pretty much stereotype. Where do I want to go from here? Do I want to go to movies? Do I want to go to TV? Do I want to go to radio? Do I want to go to talking about King's versions of movies? Oh. Let's go to radio, because that was the closest thing I did research on today, so it's closest in my mind. Radio was petering out. Stephen King actually has a very good chapter, a very long chapter, and I'm going to cut it down to a couple of paragraphs because even though I recommend a lot of these things, if you can probably find on CD used, or on Amazon, or on YouTube, probably, old radio shows of these things, from the 50s, from the 40s, from the 30s, of the scary radio shows. King talks about the big three being Lights Out, which he talks about most extensively, the Arch Oboler writings, Suspense, which was more suspenseful, funnily enough, and Dimension X, which is more science fiction. Dimension X was from 50 to 51, so we're right at the beginning of the 50s. Lights Out ended in 47, but the TV went on to TV version of Lights Out went on to 1952. And And suspense went from all the way from 1942 to 1962. So that had a good long run, and it did have, even though it was suspenseful, it did have some supernatural suspense as well, which would be horror, or close enough approximation. Did I just define horror for myself as supernatural suspense? Not really. There's another element of horror that's not just supernatural suspense. Because any dragon movie, it'd be suspense, dragon slaying. But not all of those are horror. Very few of them are horror. But if they're good, which you think that some of them are, they'd be suspenseful. So no, I didn't just define horror as supernatural suspense. But close enough approximation. Suspense had some supernatural stuff, some horrific elements. He does talk about some of these authors getting their start in radio. Ray Bradbury, I think, was one that he mentioned. I did flip through it today, but as I said before, my eyes have glazed over a few times. Arch Oboler. Dimension X. Mars. Oh. Yeah, Ray Bradbury. Mars is Heaven on Dimension X. King goes over the plot. Astronauts go to Mars. They find all their dead relatives and realize Mars is heaven. And this is great. They see grandma and they have picnics and they whatever. And then, like, the one paranoid astronaut is suspicious of this. And of course, once the astronauts are all falling asleep, the Martians take off their faces of the grandma and, their cousin that died or whatever, whoever, dead people and that they loved in life or whatever, and there's fangs and gross stuff, which is horror. So Ray Bradbury, of course, getting his beginnings in, we're talking Dimension X, so it's 50-51. Oh, goodness. Sorry, lost my train of thought again. This is my 6th day working in a row, guys, so I'm getting frazzled. I have one more day to go, so tomorrow's video is even going to be weirder. So I apologize if I phase out. It's because I'm tired. So, Dimension X being the science fiction-y one, or dark science fiction. Where did I go? There we go. Let's see. He does a lot of, King spends a lot of his time talking about the difference in our mindsets between radio times and, times when radio was very popular as a medium and be able to make a horror work. And I do recommend it because some of it still does work, especially telling ghost stories. But of course the sound effects and whatnot can be a little cheese. Got quite a bit of cheese in there. But I think it doesn't take a whole lot for horror fans to get into that old mindset, that radio mindset, to experience the horror that way. Oh, okay. Hmm. So some of the Lights Out episodes, the Arch Obler one that King was talking about, Lights Out was from 1934 to 47. The television version was from 46 to 52, so a little bit in there, in the 50s era that we're talking about. But some of the Lights Out versions were rebroadcast on Dimension X. Cool. That brings us back to the 50s again, and that explains why Stephen King knows about it, because at this time he would have only been, you know, 8-ish. I think he did say at one point. Oh, 1950 he was 8 or 3. Yeah, 1950 he said it was 3. I could look it up. And then, so you overheard some of these. About 5, 6, he was hearing the stuff on the radio with his grandfather. Oh, A Day at the Dentist. Inner Sanctum. I didn't think of that one. Day of the Dentist is another one he talks about, where the bad guy is scared of getting his teeth worked on. He's scared of the dentist, which is a legitimate fear for a lot of people. But he wronged a woman. The woman became a dentist's a wife. A dentist married the woman after she was wronged by the guy, and the dentist made it a point to go after the guy. So he bought out the painless dentist that was the bad guy's practice before and moved in. And when the guy had a toothache, he came and he goes to work on him with a drill after strapping him down to the table. Yes. Another Arch Obler. And then, of course, the chicken heart that ate the world, which apparently was available on Drop Dead, and a few of the other Obler ones were too. The chicken heart, I found out that Bill Cosby did a stand-up routine about the chicken heart. So I read the Stephen King version, and last night I listened to the Bill Cosby version. It was Bill Cosby, so it was kind of funny. It's off of Wonderfulness, but it's available on YouTube. Bill Cosby Chicken Heart on search on YouTube, and you were able to find it. About a chicken heart that was in a vat of chemicals keeping it alive. Somehow that gets knocked over and the chicken heart just grows and grows and eats people and eats buildings and eats everything else, sort of like The Blob, another movie from the 50s. Well, maybe one of the remakes was from the 50s. Yes. So in the 50s part of the history, there's going to be a lot of radio still being an influence. So for Stephen King, of course, radio was an influence on horror. And it was an influence on horror anyway, but for the history that he's talking about. Now, we're going to continue from that. Of course, Lights Out was transferred to TV for a bit. Other TV shows, of course, Alfred Hitchcock Presents was started in 55 and went all the way to 62, so we talked a bit about that yesterday. Twilight Zone started in 59, so right at the end of this decade, we're going to be seeing the beginning of the Twilight Zone. Obviously had a huge effect on horror of the 60s and 70s. Thriller was in 62. Alright, so that's that side of things. Ooh. Aha, okay. Notes, notes, notes. I did talk about them yesterday, so I'm not going to talk about them too much more today. I'll move on to films. I did mention the Hammer films and the Quatermass. I'll continue with... I'll talk about the Quatermass movies. King calls it The Creeping Unknown because that's how it was released in America. In Britain, where it was a Hammer film, so of course it was released in it's a British film company. It was the Quatermass Experiment. Scientist shoots a rocket up to space with 3 astronauts in it. Only one comes back and he's catatonic. The only thing left of the other 2 were dust in the bottom of the spacesuits. And the one that comes back is catatonic and not responsive. And it turns out that he's infested with a spore. Like he got a space spore in him, and he's about to sporate and infect the whole planet with spores. Except these get zapped by something or other, and there you go. But Quatermass is the scientist who sends the ship into space and is trying to... He doesn't want... Well, he's the one that realizes there's a spore there too, but he doesn't want the spore to be destroyed out of hand. He wants to research it, being a scientist. And at the end of the movie, when the alien is defeated, the guy is defeated that hosts the alien, he says, "Oh, I'm going to send up another rocket now." And he does. So he's not quite a mad scientist, but he's this close to being a mad scientist. He's the... What's the quote from King? He's the dark priest at the altar of techno horror. Something like that. Something along those lines. He's a stubborn... Quatermass is a stubborn guy. He's a testament to the glorious stubbornness of the human spirit, its determination to advance the store of knowledge at any cost. If, on the other hand, you're a pessimist, then Quatermass becomes the ultimate symbol of mankind's built-in limiting factor. The high priest of the techno horror film. Page 190 on Dance, of course. So, he's the scientist. He doesn't take no for an answer. He wants to get the information at all cost. Not quite a mad scientist, but we're talking this close. This was the techno horror. He talks about being one of the subtexts in horror. Fear of, inherent fear of technology. You could say Godzilla in the same breath because... Or most of the big bug movies, because of they were led about by mankind's experiment with stuff that shouldn't be messed with. I guess that comes back to Overreacher again, if you like the Noel Carroll part of the plot. Gog was one he talked about in the techno horror film. Gog and Magog were robots with the pincer hands. Early Daleks, I guess. 1954. And they ran a spaceship, and they go crazy and try to kill the astronauts and succeed in killing big number of them, by clamping with them with their pincers, or what was it centrifuge machine that the astronauts go through and spin them around. They centrifuge them to death because they keep accelerating it. The Quatermass, the experiment, was 55, by the way. I don't think I gave a year. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, film-wise, I'm not sure if obviously it's political. It has a lot of political implications, one way or another. Some people say it's the Red Scare, and some people say it's the scare of McCarthyism, I suppose. Either way, there's fear of becoming one of them. And that's one that actually we're going to talk about, because also the book was written in the 50s, so when we get to the books, we'll get to Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Jack Finney. The Thing. What is it? The Thing. He talks about it, but I don't remember how. That was the scientist as a appeaser. Whereas that was 51. In 1951's The Thing. The giant vegetable from space comes down and starts eating people. The scientist, sort of a Quatermassy guy. It actually has his name in here someplace. Am I going to think of it? Probably not. Cornthwaite. Roger Cornthwaite? Cornthwaite was the scientist's name. And the scientist was trying to appeal to the carrot from space's better instincts, which he didn't have any of, while the military guys were trying to find a way to kill it. And of course, he's batted aside, by the evil carrot from space. The scientist was seen as, and is often still seen as, the appeaser, the Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was the prime minister who didn't really, but in popular thought, was seen to appease Hitler. Appeasement. By the time he came into power at all, it was too late. Hitler was already had the ball rolling, so he just didn't shut it down fast enough. But Chamberlain aside, the Chamberlain stereotype, or the Chamberlain-esqueness is often appeasement style is often brought to the scientist. This was same thing in Independence Day. God, that took me a long time. Not as sharp as I was hoping to be. Independence Day, the alien comes down, of course. This is in 2000s, 90s. Alien comes down, they capture one, and the scientist wants to help him out and gets killed. Anyway, okay, besides that, okay, the 50s movies that King talked about when he talks about the mythic fairy tale, the horror movies as mythic fairy tales. Bad Seed, which is pretty much on everybody's list as well. I don't have this one ready. What was Bad Seed? I thought I knew it. Number 9. About a little girl who's evil. The evil little girl is your technical, your genre, subgenre. The evil little girl is pretty much a staple in horror field. She looks sweet and innocent, but she's going to burn you. If you mess with her, she's going to burn you to a crisp. Either with her mind, in some cases, or with just a good old-fashioned bottle of gasoline, and when you're least expecting it, you're going to go up in flames. That was called The Bad Seed. Night of the Hunter. I'm not familiar with this one at all. It sounds a bit like Stepdad. Weird. Also shows up in a lot of the list, but it's not one I'm familiar with it either. It's just a very short description in here. I Bury the Living was on a lot of lists. That's cemetery guy working in a cemetery finds out he can kill people who are supposed to be buried in a certain plot by putting a pin in the board. And then when he takes the pin out and he puts another color pin in, something else happens. They come back to life, I'm assuming. He doesn't mention it, but I'm sure it's good. He says that the movie becomes shit. Which is funny, and that doesn't really make me want to see it, but I'll take his word for it. And then Macabre, the book that, the movie that he talks about quite a bit, which was billed in his youth, in Stephen King's youth, as the scary thing of the summer that he wanted to see. And of course, you remember last time, the production code was just now. It was in its last phase. It ended in 1968, lost a lot of its power in 1964, and the first Supreme Court decisions that really shut it down happened in 1957, which is usually how it works. Supreme Court happens, and then 10, 15 years later, the effects take place. So Macabre, what was 17? It's a burial alive. Some guy buries a little girl alive, or they think he does. It's a question mark because Stephen King's trying to be, well, succeeds in being mysterious. So I'm not really familiar with that one either. But that one didn't really show up on any of the list. I have to find out more about that one. Yes. That's this. Other films that he does talk about from this list, I'll go through them pretty quickly. The Bad Seed, of course, I did mention. Creature from the Black Lagoon, he talks about quite extensively. It was the first horror movie he recollects. And of course, it's a good one. The Creeping Unknown, that's the Quatermass Experiment. Curse of the Demon, not familiar with it, 1957. Do I need to put the years on these? I could put the years on the rest of them. Diabolique, Henri Georges Clouzot. Sorry, mispronouncing that one. That's 1955. Enemy from Space, also Val Guest. That's a Quatermass Experiment director. Probably another Quatermass movie, to be honest. That's 57. The Fly, Kurt Newman, the original Fly, not the Jeff Goldblum. Was it Vincent Price? No, it wasn't. It was somebody else. Somebody else that reminds me of Vincent Price for some reason. One of my favorite authors actually did the screenplay for that. It's James Clavell. He's not a horror writer. He wrote Taipan, Shogun, King Rat, Noble House, that sort of stuff. Very good author. But he wrote the screenplay for The Fly, the original The Fly. The H-Man, Inoshiro Honda. I'm not familiar with that one. I'm assuming that sounds Japanese. And if it's Japanese during this era, 58, it's probably... H has to do with hydrogen, like bomb things, radioactive. I can only guess, but I'm off by much. Horrors of the Black Museum by Arthur Crabtree is the director, 1959. Not one I'm familiar with, but sounds cool. I Bury the Living, we mentioned, that's 58. The Incredible Shrinking Man was 57. We're going to talk about the book version, so I'm just going to go over the plot thing when I talk about the book version. It's based on Richard Matheson. Jack Arnold was the director. It was not a bad movie for 57. And of course it's 57-ish special effects, but it's not bad. Man fighting a giant spider with a giant, well, he's shrinking, so it's not a giant, but with a needle as a sword, or as a spear, rather. It's good for special effects. It's not bad for the time. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Again, we're going to talk about that when we talk about Jack Finney's book. Don Siegel was the original director, 56. I didn't mention that it was redone in the 70s, and it was, with quite a few people. Donald Sutherland. Oh, I can't think of the other people. Donald Sutherland was the main guy. It Came from Outer Space, Jack Arnold as well, 53. A lot of it, saucer movies. Saucers and big bugs, you're going to find a lot of them in the 50s. It, The Terror from Beyond Space, which was Edward L. Kahn in 58. Macabre, William Castle, 58. Night of the Hunter, that's Charles Lawton, 55. Not of This Earth, Roger Corman. Again, Roger Corman. We talked about him yesterday. For doing all the Edgar Allan Poe ones. He did Not of This Earth in 56. The Seventh Seal, Ingmar Bergman. We talked about him yesterday as well because of the Night of the Wolf. Night of the Wolf? Something of the Wolf. Hungry Like the Wolf? No. Sorry, bad joke. I apologize. Oh, I'm just not going to find it anymore. But Ingmar Bergman in 56 did The Seventh Seal. It's the famous one of the guy playing chess with death. That's the Bergman scene from Seventh Seal. Black Death taking out a caravan type thing. And Death playing chess with a knight guy. Again, he's a very directory director. People who really are into movies talk about Ingmar Bergman like he's a demigod. Um, Moving on, Them by Gordon Douglas in 1954. The Thing, Christopher Nyby in 1951. We talked about that as well. And going down to X the Unknown, Leslie Norman, which I think I looked up, but I don't remember the information on it. Oh, well, let's see. Right. So then I think we're down to the books. Oh, no, wait, are we? That's 60s. Oh, no. Other than movies, I do have additional list of movies. Donovan's Brain. I talked about a few times. One of the movie treatments of it was 1953. It was on one of the lists of the best horror movies of the 50s. King talks about I Was a Teenage Frankenstein and I Was a Teenage Werewolf as being the teen type things, sociopoliticals. Sociopoliticals? Or he just talks about them in general. I'm not sure, I don't remember. It's all the King is just being farming a soup and souping together. I can't keep it straight in my head. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was 1957. I think I Was a Teenage Werewolf was about that time as well. A doctor sewing people together, sewing corpses together to form a Frankenstein type monster, or a doctor putting a guy under hypnosis to bring them back into a more primal state, which turns him into a werewolf in the I Was a Teenage Werewolf. I think it was the same guy who played the doctor in both. Stephen King talks about them as being 50s-ish movies of The Outsider. That's where he talks about it. He talks about what not to do. A social illustration of what not to do. If you're going to turn into a werewolf, you have to at least take off your leather jacket. Because show some school spirit. Come on. Anyway. I talked about the alligator people in the Fusion section. That was 1954. Godzilla I mentioned already. The House on Haunted Hill was remade with Famke Janssen in the 2000s. It was originally in 1959. The Hammer films I talked about, and lots of big bugs. That's my other note. Do I want to save changes to document 1? Yes, I suppose. 50s films? 50s films. Yeah, this is professional. Hey. Alright, oh yes. So for books, we're going into books from the 50s. Ray Bradbury remakes an appearance with Dandelion Wine and The October Country. Roald Dahl remakes an appearance with Someone Like You, 53. Jack Finney we're going to talk about to some extent. He also had that was 55, and The Third Level, another Jack Finney, was 57. William Golding, Lord of the Flies. Stephen King several times has said that this is his penultimate horror to its highest degree as pure art is best illustrated by Lord of the Flies. And according to Noel Carroll, of course, it wouldn't be a horror book at all because it's not supernatural, unless you take that dreamy fly thing in the middle before the kid finds a parachute and dies. Spoilers. Don't spoil Lord of the Flies. What's wrong with you? Read Lord of the Flies. I don't know if I'd count it as horror, but it's definitely good, and horror fans would like it. I would think. Most horror fans would like it. Oh, Shirley Jackson. She started in the 40s and went on to through the 50s. House on the Haunted Hill, of course, is going to be not House on Haunted. I'm getting confused now. Haunting of Hill House will be discussed later on. That was 59. The Sundial was 58, and that was sort of a House on Haunting of Hill House light, according to what King's describing in here. Or was that something I read in Carol? I need a weekend, guys. My brain is soup. Gerald Kirsch, The Men Without Bones, 1954. Bernard Malamud, The Magic Barrel was 58, and The Natural was 52. I think I've seen the movie for The Natural. It's a baseball movie. I'm not sure where King's going with that one. He mentions The Magic Barrel. He asterisks that one as being the important books. Someone Like You by Dahl was asterisk, the 53. The Body Snatchers, of course. And the third level was asterisk for Jack Finney, 55 and 57. Lord of the Flies, asterisk, of course. King raves about that book in the interview books very, very often. Haunting the Hill House, asterisk. Men Without Bones, asterisk. The Magic Barrel was asterisk, and Natural was not. I could have swore that was a baseball movie. I think it is a baseball movie. I don't think it's horror. I don't remember it that well. Or I don't even remember if I've seen it, to be honest. The Magic Barrel, he might have written a horror book as well. I don't know. Richard Matheson is going to be starting in the 50s. I Am Legend was written in 54. I think probably that means that the first... when was The Last Man on Earth? That was the first film treatment of I Am Legend. What? Oh, that was 64? I should have talked about it yesterday. Or did I talk about it yesterday? Stephen King should have had it on his list. Oh, I should have talked about it yesterday. So Last Man on Earth, the best of the treatments of I Am Legend. The Omega Man's probably my least favorite. That was from the 70s. I know I mentioned that one in the 70s. Or the 60s. No, 70s. And then the movie of I Am Legend with Will Smith was in the late 2000s. It was the second best. It had some elements that worked and some elements that didn't. I Am Legend, 1954. The Shrinking Man, which we'll talk about in the book section because King talks about it. And of course we talked about it a little bit in the movies. Was 54. And then Stir of Echoes was 58. Stir of Echoes, the movie with Kevin Bacon, was based on this, of course. And that's one that King talks about in What's Scary. I can click. There we go. He liked it. I didn't. I just didn't get into it. And Ghost really freaked me out, so I usually am like, oh, I'm impressed by this Ghost. It might have freaked me out, but it didn't stick with me as well. It wasn't as... Anyway. I haven't read the book, so I can't say anything about the book. Flannery O'Connor, A Good Man is Hard to Find. King mentions this one earlier when he talks about The Tale of the Hook. If you were going to make The Tale of the Hook into a full-length book... I'm not trying to rhyme. It would be A Good Man is Hard to Find. Um, Flannery O'Connor, and that's 55. Flannery O'Connor is one of these major authors of the 20th century types. This one's called, the author's name is Sarban? Sarban? That's all I have. Ringstones and the Sound of His Horn, I have 52. 1952. Not familiar with that one at all. Theodore Sturgeon. Caviar, The Dreaming Jewels, and then Some of Your Blood, which was mentioned in the 60s. And John Wyndham was mentioned quite a bit when talking about monsterness. The chrysalids was the quote that you get, be on the lookout for beware the mutant. Blessed is the status quo and stuff like that. That comes from the chrysalids. And he also wrote The Night of the Triffids, which was a movie we talked about briefly that seemed to pop up over and over and over again. But not one I'm familiar with. But I should try to make a point of finding that one out, because that looks cool. The Day of the Triffids. I'll get there. 55 and 51. Chrysalids 55, Day of the Triffids 51. John Wyndham. So briefly, that water didn't last all that long. Oh, I've been talking for 50 minutes, that's why. It has lasted. I'm just finished with it. The Haunting of Hill House, I talked extent when I went over Ghosts. It's Shirley Jackson. It was made into movie The Haunting in the 60s? 50s? Oh, I'm going to have to look this one up too. The original The Haunting. $1963. Yeah, I must have talked about it yesterday. I'm trying to remember how much I talked about it in Ghosts, so how much I should talk about it now. I think I talked about it pretty extensively in the Ghost section. Eleanor. Oh, and I talked about it, of course, in the Fantastic section. So I'm gonna skip it for the most part. A very important book for modern American horror, and movies as well. Catherine Zeta-Jones is the other version. Good special effects, but not as good plot-wise, and not even close to Fantastic plot-wise. Fantastic in the, which version of Fantastic I meant. So Haunting of Hill House. I'm just going to jump over that one real quick. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. No, which is the Body Snatcher in book form, is it not? Oh, am I getting confused? I wrote it down in my notes, but did I write it down in my notes wrong? Goodness gracious. No, it's the Body Snatchers. Jack Finney, 1955. I read this last year. It was pretty good, actually. I found it at a used bookstore. The plot is essentially pods come down from space and take over somebody. The pod becomes a person. The pod forms himself into a person shape. A blank person. And then takes over that person, and the other person goes away. The real Bob. And then the fake Bob's walking around, and he puts a pod under somebody else's house, and that pod turns into a person, and then that person goes away, and then they start spreading. Alien invasion, essentially. It's suburban paranoia is how King describes it. because it's a small town in California, and the doctor is called by a bunch of people. This is like, 15 people into the invasion, I suppose, and the pods are spreading. Yeah, the pods are spreading. So a woman calls up and says, "My uncle's not my uncle. Um, he looks exactly like my uncle. I was waiting for today because today was the day he's getting his haircut, and I know my uncle has a mole here, and I wanted to see if the mole would be here when he got his haircut." And of course it was, just like my uncle. It's a great line. One of the best lines from the book, actually. So the doctor's sort of thinking, "Oh, this woman's just crazy. It's her uncle acting just like the uncle, and in every way, and even the mole's there. So what's the problem?" Well, there's something is the problem. And so, of course, she calls back 2 weeks later and says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was just, I was confused. There's nothing wrong with my uncle. I was just crazy for a bit." Of course, you know then that she's taken over by another pod. Little kids say my mom's not my mom. Stuff like that's going on. And the doctor has to say, "Well, what's the deal? My teacher's not my teacher. My mom's not my mom." These sort of things from little kids. So he passed it off as the little kids being too imaginative or whatever. And then his buddy calls and says, "I have a blank body on my pool table." Because one of the blanks that wasn't fully formed yet, it was turning into him. He finds it first. So he calls the doctor and says, "You got to take a look at this." So those are the guys that turn out to be fighting the people, the pod people. It's good. I definitely recommend it. And yeah, the Shrinking Man turned into the movie. Oh, so this is it. The Body Snatcher by Jack Finney becomes the Invasion of the Body Snatchers in movie form. The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson becomes The Incredible Shrinking Man in movie form. So that's why I'm getting confused. They keep changing the titles from book to movie. And The Haunting of Hill House becomes The Haunting in movie. No wonder I'm confused. The Shrinking Man. Through getting exposed to one chemical in one place and another chemical in another place, this guy starts shrinking. It is I did talk about this a bit in magnification, making everything bigger. It's the opposite. It's him becoming smaller, which makes everything else bigger for him. And he's the one that you, as the audience, identify with, so you're scared for him, and that means you're scared. So the Shrinking Man, he's shrinking. First, he realizes his wife doesn't have to stand on tippy toes to kiss him anymore. But he goes off into his day, and then he eventually has to stand on tiptoes to kiss his wife. So he goes to the doctor, and the doctors can't figure it out, and then he just like blah 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 blah. Stuff becomes more threatening, obviously. Children, who would be usually, when you're a foot and a half taller than them, are fine. They're not a threat to you. But when you're a couple inches shorter than them, they become a threat. When he gets down to a certain size, the house cat becomes a huge threat, licking his lips and then chasing him from the dollhouse that he was living in into the basement where he disappears because he's shrinking. The climactic scene is, of course, him fighting the spider, which I mentioned earlier, with a needle that he finds from a pincushion. as a spear, and he's fighting the spider. And of course, he's still shrinking. So at the end, he wins against the spider, but he's still shrinking. Stuff is going to become more and more and more threatening. And as he blinks out of sight, he says, "I'm still here." Something along those lines. I think I'm botching the final line of the movie. The movie line is really good too. The movie line, I don't know, I might be getting book line and movie line confused. Oh my goodness. Well, I've been talking for an hour now, so I think with my brain deadness, I'm just going to call it there. Next time, I'm going to go back to the 40s, which is a dry area, as everybody says, and is another walking without a tightrope, because King's pretty much done. His point was to be from the 50s to the 80s, 1950 to 1980. 50s, 60s, 70s decades. He talks about the 40s being dry. I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that was going on, because stuff still was going on. But I have to sort of I only have a little bit of information for some of these. And then 30s in it stuff. I mean, we're going to go into supernatural horror and literature. So the 30s-ish, I'm going to not go by decades so much. I'm going to use Howard Phillips Lovecraft, HP's versions. When was this originally published? It doesn't say, because it only says the Dover version. 1927. I think I can handle the I'll probably do a 30s version on my own and then go with the 20s. I'll go Modern Masters, which is the last chapter. He's going chronologically, of course. The last chapter in this would be the Modern Masters, according to Lovecraft. And I'll call that the 20s and 20-ish-ness. And then we'll go back from there into the 1800s. Sorry. Yeah, 19th century. Or late, the 10s and the zeros, the aughts. Of course, I'm going to do some more research on that one as well as I go along. So 40s, 30s, and then jumping into supernatural horror and literature. And relying firmly on his stuff for the 20s, and then I can go in and do some of the early versions of films, because by the 1880s you're not going to be dealing with film anymore. Maybe some plays, but not really dealing with films. So we're pretty winding down on film at this point. So the beginning of television was in this section. In another 2 sections, we're going to be prior to film beginning. God, talk right, Andrew. Ugh. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I'll continue History of Horror next time on Horror Analysis. Have a great night.